everybody joined forces to get this book done in time for it to be used right now. But there was one person, Mattia Kramer, our esteemed research colleague, who really rode herd over the research and the wordsmithing, so that the book you'll receive this evening has one voice, and it's accessible, and it's really written for all of us who are coming to this as more novice users. So it's a wonky book and a wonky subject, but for a human crowd. So we try to bring the book home, and it was Mattia's great brilliance and her wordsmithing and her terrific research that pulled every single staff person and every single intern's efforts together. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mattia now.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to start with a story because I think that's the best way into this. There's a man by the name of Clay who lives in Plano, Texas, and he has twin daughters with severe intellectual disabilities and autism. And these daughters require constant care. Because of a service of the Medicaid program, Medicaid is the federal health insurance program for low-income Americans, a caretaker stays with Clay's daughters while he goes out and earns a living. If not for that service provided by Medicaid, Clay would have to choose between going to work and caring for his daughters. And the girls would have to be institutionalized. Now this year, a budget passed the US House of Representatives that would cut Medicaid funding to a degree that millions of Americans, including people like Clay's daughters, would lose access to most health care. And maybe that's something that we as a country feel that we have to do in order to reduce federal spending. And maybe it's not. But either way, I figured most people, when that budget passed back in March, most people had no idea what it contained. The federal budget affects the life of every American, although we hardly ever think about its influence. The federal budget funds everything from highways so we can get from place to place, to clean drinking water, to the rule of law. And that budget, that's funded with our money. It's yours and mine from the tax dollars that we pay. But even though the federal budget affects us every day, and even though it's funded with our own money, most Americans think this is an issue that only belongs to Washington insiders. Meanwhile, we face problems as individuals and as small communities, like unaffordable health care, or rising college tuition, or the streetlights being turned off in some cities and towns because of budget shortfalls. And we don't connect those local or personal struggles to challenges that we face as a nation. But they are connected. In the same way that Clay's daughter's access to a caretaker depends on decisions made in Washington. And those are decisions that are made right now in a process that very few Americans can follow. But I don't go down this dark road, this bad news, without being able to offer some hope, because there is hope. There's a big bright spot, and here it is. A little bit of information goes a long way. One experiment gave 1,000 randomly selected Americans solid budget information. These were people who had no exposure to this topic before. They gave them solid budget information, and these folks rose to the challenge of sorting out our budget problems. They prioritized certain kinds of spending, and they actually reduced budget deficits by cutting obsolete military programs and by raising taxes on the most well-off Americans. Now, in another experiment, Americans of all political views were brought together in cities across the country for a day of deliberation about the federal budget. Folks first learned about the budget, and then together, people with totally different political ideas came up with long-term blueprints for our national priorities. And these people said that they left feeling engaged and empowered. And in an incubator classroom just down the road from here in Chicopee High School, students studied the federal budget in social studies class. They learned the budget process and how our tax dollars are spent, and then they talked about how they would change things if they were in charge. What would happen if more people of all ages and all backgrounds understood and then influenced how our tax dollars are spent? Here in Massachusetts, the federal budget, federal funding, accounts for about a third of the state budget, 33 cents on every dollar. It turns out a lot of that is Medicaid funding. But federal dollars also allow this state to keep the lights on and the doors open at the University of Massachusetts. They keep our highways paved so we can get from place to place. They fund nutrition and early childhood education for low-income school children. Now, maybe you have strong feelings about what ought to be funded by the federal government. Maybe you think that there ought to be less funding for certain things and more funding for other things. How do you go about communicating your priorities to Washington? If you believe that something is wasting your tax dollars or that something else desperately needs more resources put to it, how do you go about communicating that to Washington if it is indeed our money being spent and our country being shaped? So for that reason, to answer that question, this book isn't just an explanation of the federal budget. This has a starter kit, tools for engagement, a take action chapter, so that folks of all backgrounds, once they are in possession of this information, have the opportunity to get involved and to start to influence how our democracy works, because knowledge by itself won't be enough to steer our country toward the will of the people. It will involve rolling up our sleeves and getting into that messy business of democracy. Consider the evidence. In 2009, a group of people got together. They'd hardly been politically active before, and they called themselves the Tea Party. That changed what's been happening in Washington since then. That changed the federal budget, and it's changed the discussion that's happening even now. Another group of people got together last year, and they called themselves Occupy Wall Street. They said they won't stand for politics or an economy that serves only the wealthy few, and they put income inequality at the center of the national conversation. Because of that, something called the Buffett Rule came on the scene as just one proposal for making our tax code more progressive. And in a smaller, though at least as inspiring example, high school students from around the country submitted videos to National Priorities Project's If I Had $1 Trillion Youth Video Contest. This is a contest that asks young people what they would do if they had the money that's been spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You want to know what they said? They said more money for public schools. That's what these high school students said. And to fight homelessness, to fund cancer research, and to tackle global hunger. But they didn't stop there. They didn't just make videos and tell us about what they wanted to do. They went to Washington. With our executive director, Joe Comerford, these young people traveled to Washington and they met with their legislators and they said, these are the priorities that we have for this country. That's what it means to be American. And this book, A People's Guide to the Federal Budget, it's a stepping stone. It's one stepping stone on the path from this world we're in right now, where most people think that our country is moving in the wrong direction and that they can't make a difference, into a different world in which more people feel that they're active decision makers about our national priorities. This is a book about the federal budget, yes, but this is a book about strengthening our democracy. It is a radical notion to think that the federal budget could genuinely reflect the priorities of the people. From where we sit right now, that is a radical idea. I'm going to close my prepared remarks with a passage by Barbara Ehrenreich. She's the author of Nickel and Dimed, and she graciously contributed the foreword to our book. When Nickel and Dimed was first published, lots of people asked me what I thought should be done differently in order to help working people. Affordable housing, I said. Healthcare for all people. Better public schools and better public transportation. That's my wish list, though I realize it may not be your wish list. There's much disagreement about what the role of government should be and what the federal government can afford. You may well disagree with my priorities, But agree or disagree, you and I both should understand what's in this book. We should understand the many kinds of federal taxes that we pay and the ways the government spends that money. And we should understand it because it's our money making its way through that complicated federal budget process. This year, the President, the entire House of Representatives, and a third of the Senate are up for re-election. With more budget cuts in the pipeline, the officials we elect in November will have the opportunity to reshape our country for years to come. If we're to have any hope of navigating the complex decisions our elected officials will make in future years, we need this book. A People's Guide to the Federal Budget is our way in.